So this PowerPoint is going to be covering a lot of the interwar period that's between World War I and World War II, starting about 1918 and going all the way to 1939, 1940. Um, so you might recall during World War I that the Russians dropped out of the war because of different issues going on in its country, and this is what this PowerPoint is going to be about, the Russian Revolution. Um, so the czars are the kings, more or less, or Caesars of Russia, the Russian Empire, and they're eventually going to lose power because of their cruel and oppressive rule. They they run what is known as an autocracy, where the czar has absolute power, where the rich and wealthy are the ones that have the control. So under the Tsar Alexander III, he runs an autocratic rule. He oppresses other cultures. He makes everybody assimilate into the Russian culture. He forces people, especially in public education, to speak Russian, makes it an official language, and as well as the Russian Orthodox Church. He forces people to convert to that as well. We've seen in the past that these strong arm techniques don't work very well. And in 1894, Nicholas II takes over, and there's hope that he might reduce some of these tight constraints that he's putting on his people, but unfortunately, Nicholas II just continues with Alexander III's policies and continues to abuse a lot of his people. Russia, for a long time, was quite a bit far behind a lot of Western Europe in terms of industrialization and modernization and a modern economy. So during the reign of Nicholas and Alexander, they try to industrialize very rapidly, and they do a pretty good job of doing that. Between 1863 and 1900, factories more than double in the amount. They become the fourth largest producer of steel, and they also begin the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which will become one of the largest railroad systems in the world. And it's constructed between 1891 and 1916 and spans thousands of miles across the Russian Empire all the way to the Pacific Ocean to Moscow. However, with this rapid industrialization, there's a lot of discontent that is brewing among the working class specifically. As we saw in other countries, the cities that became rapidly urbanized saw a lot of poor working conditions, living conditions. You had child labor and stuff like this. But in Russia, this is happening about 50 or 60 years after it happened in Great Britain and Germany. So workers start to strike, and the idea of Karl Marx and communism really strikes a chord with a lot of these workers. And some Marxists that follow Karl Marx's ideas gain power and influence in a lot of cities across Russia. The Marxists split in two, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks are led by this man here. This is Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, and he's going to lead the Russian Revolution. So leading up to the Russian Revolution, Russia's in kind of crisis mode. There's several different events that lead to the fall of the Russian czars. The first being the Russo-Japanese War. This is in the late 1800s, where there's fighting over a territory called Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula between Russia and Japan. Russia, even though it's a European power, is actually defeated by the Japanese in kind of a humiliating war. Remember that the Japanese also industrialized very rapidly after they were kind of exposed by the Americans. In 1905, there was an event called Bloody Sunday, where there was a couple hundred poor workers that marched on St. Petersburg and asked the Tsar to come out and talk to them, Tsar Nicholas II. Please come talk to us. Let's resolve our differences. Instead of coming out and talking, he had his soldiers open up fire onto the protesters, and it actually ended up killing several protesters, as you can see down in the painting on the bottom right-hand side. So there was a lot of unrest, obviously, among the workers and the people of Russia. So the Tsar capitulated and said, we will create the First Duma, which is kind of the parliament. But as we'll see in the future, he actually doesn't really use the parliament. He kind of just ignores it. And then World War I comes about, and Russia, even though it has a lot of soldiers, it's very poorly equipped. Its industrial machine is not nearly as efficient as Germany or Britain or France. And so the war does not go well for them. hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of soldiers are dying. Civilians get tired of the war, and eventually the soldiers mutiny, and the Russians are going to have to pull from the war. In the March of 1917, there was something called the March Revolution. This is still during World War I, and women textile workers started a strike. They said the conditions, especially the shortages of bread and fuel caused by World War I, as well as the harsh reality of the Tsar's network, was not working out for them. A lot of those mutinied soldiers, those ones that left the front line, eventually joined these women protesters and start kind of causing problems in the capital city of Moscow. So because of these riots, the Tsar eventually does step down, and he and his family are executed for treason against the state. The provisional government that is set up in its stead fails, but there is this formation of something called Soviets across Russia, which are pretty much local councils consisting of workers, peasants, and soldiers. So this idea that we should all be equal, there shouldn't be an aristocracy that rules over everybody else. In this atmosphere, in this environment, Vladimir Lenin returned to Petrograd. He had been exiled in Germany during this time period because of his radical views of communism and trying to change the Russian society. So in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution begins. And this is when the Soviets, those small councils that were all over Russia, actually joined with Lenin and that one group of Marxists known as the Bolsheviks. And Lenin led the charge with a slogan saying, "Peace, land, and bread." We're going to bring peace in terms of we're going to stop World War I. We're going to make sure that everybody has access to bread, and then we're going to free the serfs and make sure everybody has land. So the Bolsheviks have something called the Red Guards. They're armed military wing of their political party, and they actually storm the provisional government and take over and put Lenin in power. You can kind of think of this as a coup d'etat. Once Lenin is in power, he moves rapidly to more or less make Russia a more Marxist system. First, he orders all farmland to be taken away from the aristocrats and distributed to the peasants. All the factories would no longer be owned by the government or individual wealthy people. They would actually be given to the workers. And he also immediately signed a truce with Germany to stop the fighting in World War I. So at this point, Lenin has control of pretty much all of Russia, but obviously the wealthy, the aristocrats, are worried for their own conditions. They're seeing a lot of the businesses taken away and given to the workers. And so a civil war starts in Russia. So you have the Bolshevik Red Army, which is Lenin's side, versus something that becomes known as the White Army, which is pretty much those who support the Tsar, any Democrats, any socialists who oppose Lenin, pretty much people who do not want a communist state established in Russia. Leon Trotsky becomes kind of the right-hand man of Lenin, and he is the general of the Red Army. Several Western nations do not trust this communism, do not trust Lenin, and so they actually support the White Army in fighting against the communism. This war went on for quite some time, and it was quite bloody. Over 14 million people died, and this is right after World War I, where several other million people died as well. Eventually, the Red Army is successful, and they are able to crush the Tsarist supporters, the Democrats, the Socialists, the White Army that was supported by the West. So here you can see some maps. A lot of the fighting was in Western Russia, around Europe, and most of the battles went to the Red Army. So eventually the Civil War stops, and Lenin is able to restore order. He is the undisputed leader of the Russian people, but Russia was in a bad state once Lenin really took over and had complete control. So what Lenin decided to do, instead of completely enforcing communism, he restored small capitalism at first, but he held control over the industries and banks and communication, etc. This idea was really to spur economic growth, which he was successful at, and the country slowly recovered economically and was able to move forward. Politically, Lenin kind of followed some of the same policies of the czars themselves. The Bolsheviks were very afraid of nationalism. Nationalism. It's a huge threat to their political party, um, as it was to the czars as well. So the Bolsheviks really kind of suppress any sense of self-determination or anything like that outside of Moscow or around the Russian Empire. What he does do is he creates several self-governing republics under the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, which has become known as the USSR. So the USSR is established in 1922, and it's gonna last until about 1990 or 1991. And so this is kind of your first communist state that is developed. After Lenin dies, and we're going to go more in detail on this in class, Joseph Stalin, who was a member of the Bolshevik Party, eventually is able to kill enough of his opposition, his competition, to become kind of a full-fledged dictator and something we'll call a totalitarian. So he gains control of the party by 1928 when Lenin kind of dies, and we will see the immense changes that he makes to the party and to the Russian state or the Soviet state by the time World War II rolls around.